Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Dr. Bilal Phillips. I am the founder and chancellor of the Islamic Online University. My main profession is that of a teacher, lecturer, instructor. I also advise various organizations which are engaged in dawah as well as charities, etc. My parents were Jamaicans. They were born in Jamaica and they were both teachers. They migrated to Canada, studied in university in Canada, and settled there. I grew up in Canada. My time in Jamaica was relatively short. I left there when I was around 9 years old, and most of my growing up period was basically in Canada. And it had its own trials, because at the time when my parents emigrated to Canada, there were very few black people in Canada. Canada was a white country. So in the schools that I went to, I was the only black student in the whole school, which was something disconcerting and a bit uncomfortable, having at least grown up my earlier life in Jamaica, where I looked like everybody else, and nobody had any issues with the fact that I was in any way different from them. Whereas in Canada, I became acutely aware of being different. And it had its own psychological challenges, which I managed to get through that period without too much damage. But alhamdulillah, my parents being, successful educators, this helped me to feel comfortable, relatively comfortable, in spite of the fact that I was so different from everybody else. Of course, by the time I'd reached my teens, the latter part of my growing up, initial growing up stages, the numbers of immigrants to Canada had increased. So, I became more and more a part of an immigrant community from African origins, which of course naturally made me feel that much more comfortable. Where the challenge lay in Canada as the odd man out, as a child, is that young people, children, can be very insensitive and they can be very rough with people who are different. So I wanted to fit in, but people would not allow me to fit in one way or another. I experienced different elements of what were in fact racism. I mean, that's what we were exposed to. Of course, it was nothing like what blacks in America were facing. They didn't, Canadians were not as violent or as harsh as in America, but nonetheless, I did, or I was impacted by racism in the culture of that time. Finding Islam took another decade, almost. After graduating from high school, my family migrated to Malaysia. I went to A-levels, did A-level studies there in Malaysia, and had other experiences now with other people who were not themselves white. They were a different set of people, but again, still I was something of an odd person out, you know. There were not any other black people from African origin there in Malaysia, not part of Malaysia where I was. This is way before the period when many Africans have gone to Malaysia to study. That's much, much later on. I mean, I'm talking about the late 60s, early 70s. So in that period of time, I was exposed to Islam without really understanding it or benefiting from that exposure very much. When I returned to Canada to study in university, in Simon Fraser University, I was majoring in biochemistry. I got involved in student politics. And from that involvement in student politics, I decided to convert to communism, because communism seemed to present a solution for the woes and the trials and tribulations of humankind. I was a communist for some 3, almost 4 years, actively engaged. I went down to the US and was engaged with members of the Communist Party and movement, etc. Till eventually I felt I was not going anywhere. I went back up to Canada to continue my university education. And there I became involved in a political group there in Toronto, which combined socialism, communism, communist thought, with Afrocentrism. We became, Afrocentric individuals, conscious of our African origins, and at the same time, very much seeking political enlightenment and growth, taking as our figures people like Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah and Nyeri and others, Sekou Toure and others who professed African nationalism within a socialist, communist kind of framework. So whilst I was being drawn into this pool, one of my friends in the organization which I was in converted to Islam, and that caused me to start to look at Islam as a possible system that perhaps had what communism seemed to lack. I saw failure in communism in its inability to compete with capitalism economically. Though scientifically the Russians were on par with the Americans, in fact maybe ahead of them in some fields, but economically they couldn't compete in world economics. So there was definitely a weakness in that system that I realized. And then also I could see that in establishing themselves, communism in Russia, Stalin massacred millions. And Mao massacred millions also in China, all in the name of, pure communist state. So there was a vicious element which I had my doubts about. So when this person converted to Islam, I asked for some literature and started to read about it, and I was quickly convinced, I became quickly convinced that Islam was the answer. It did have everything that was lacking in the other systems and seemed to be free of any of the negativities that exist in those systems. The book which really was the turning point for me was the book known as Islam, the Misunderstood Religion by Dr. Muhammad Qutb, who did a comparison between communism, capitalism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, etc., from an economic perspective, from a political perspective, from a spiritual perspective, from all different perspectives, and clearly showed that Islam was superior to all the rest. in all of these various areas. So I quickly became convinced and decided to convert to Islam back in 1972 when I was 25 years old. After accepting Islam in Toronto, my immediate teachers were immigrants, mostly of Pakistani, Indian Pakistani origin, Bangladeshi, so and so, who gave me my basic understandings of the teachings of Islam. Then I took on a teacher from Egypt who gave me also further knowledge and understanding. And I experienced also the benefits of other cultures from North Africa, like Morocco, etc., as well as, from West Africa with some Nigerian and others who helped me to further understand Islam. But what happened for me with all these different backgrounds, I became acutely aware of the madhabs and their contradictions. The Hanafi, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian Muslims pushed Hanafiism. I mean, they did mention there are 4 madhabs, you can follow anyone you want, but basically, being Hanafi is probably the best choice because most Muslims are Hanafis. Abu Hanifa was the first of the Imams, etc., etc. So there was this encouragement to become a Hanafi, which I accepted initially. Then when I took on a teacher, who was from Egypt, and he began to teach me with evidences and studied the book Fiqh Sunnah, etc., I started to understand a difference with the Shafi'i school because he explained the differences as being based on the fact that this was another school of Islamic law. I started to see contradictions between what was there in the Shafi'i and what was there in the Hanafi. And then with my Moroccan and West African friends, I also got exposed to the Maliki school of thought and the differences which they had, etc., which led me to seek Islam elsewhere. I realized that those people who were teaching me were not scholars. They were just common people. They were passing on their cultures to me. They didn't really understand the reasons why these differences existed, the significance, how should one deal with these differences. Of course, they said, it's all the same, just follow on. I realized quickly that I needed to go overseas. I needed to travel outside of the country to the centers of Islam. I mean, where Islam began, in Saudi Arabia, in Medina. I applied to go and study in the Medina University, and that's where I began a serious study of Islam, completing a diploma in Arabic first, then a bachelor's in Islamic studies, then a master's in Riyadh at King Saud University, College of Education, focusing on Aqidah or theology. And then I did a PhD from the University of Wales in the UK, also in the area of theology, Islamic theology or Aqidah, as we refer to it in Arabic. So that was my early educational background. From that early study in Medina, I became a teacher of high school, junior high, did a master's, extended my teaching. When I did my PhD, I became a university lecturer in the UAE. I taught there in American University of Dubai for some 10 years, and also in Ajman University, Preston University, also in Ajman, setting up a Department of Islamic Studies, and eventually going to India and setting up the first Islamic university in India. Once I became engaged in the educational process, as a teacher, lecturer in both Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and in Qatar, I was also invited to give lectures in different parts of the world. And For a number of years, I did a lot of traveling to many places, to the UK, US, all over Europe, in Asia, and into Africa, mostly East Africa at that time. And when I became sort of on the radar for those who were trying to contain Islam and to stop its spread, then the issue of bannings and all these type of things started to arise. I must say that probably the most notable incident which sort of brought me to visibility, amongst those actively engaged in controlling and limiting Islam, was after the Gulf War with Saddam Hussein. I was involved in and led a team of du'at, or Muslim propagators, who set up, with the permission of the American military, a camp or a tent in the middle of their camp. And over a period of some 5.5 months, we had more than 3,000 Americans accept Islam. So that sort of made me now visible. And eyes were focused on me, and the pressure was being put on different governments that, where I lived in Saudi Arabia, forcing me to leave Saudi Arabia, being in, after 20 years in Saudi Arabia, being in UAE for some 10 years, and then again pressure coming, forcing me to leave, and going to Qatar, where alhamdulillah, I've lived now for the last 13 years, while also establishing residence in West Africa and East Africa. In time, I was put on a blacklist, a no-fly list, so I couldn't even fly over American airspace or over its waters, along with other leading propagators like Dr. Zakir Naik and Hussein Yee and others. We became increasingly blocked from doing lecture tours and attending conferences, etc., in the countries of the West. That limited my ability to move, and I basically focused more on the education side. This is where I also set up the university online, Islamic Online University, to get that reach through other means. So though, for example, I'm not able to go to the US, the largest number of students in the Islamic Online University, which is close to 50,000 students, are from the US. So the dawah, or educational effort and process, is reaching Americans in spite of the fact that I can't go to America. So I didn't really worry about this. And of course, you've heard of the pressures that are being put on people like Dr. Zakir Naik, where even in India, he had to leave India. They shut down all of his centers across India. They seek to put him in jail. He's had to relocate, find another country to live in, to seek other, nationalities. And we know that he is just engaged in Peace TV. That is his main effort. And anybody who has watched Peace TV would clearly defend him as a non-violent propagator of Islam, without any doubt. Yet, he has become, for the West, public enemy number one. I'm maybe number 2 or number 3. But where I'm faced, as he is faced and others are faced, with these roadblocks to dawah. Well, in terms of how do we go around it, as I mentioned, I focused into the area of education instead, and it sent me basically to Africa as a result of this. So now, especially in West Africa, I've traveled more extensively. The university has spread its wings here in Nigeria, as well as in the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Ghana. We're looking into Liberia, Cameroon, and other countries. I've also gone into Malawi and Tanzania, Uganda, etc. So it has opened up horizons for the university in Africa, where the effort is well appreciated. And alhamdulillah, tens of thousands are benefiting from the Islamic Online University's presence and reach into these various countries. And likewise, alhamdulillah, Dr. Zakir, his Peace TV, has reached the point where the last time I spoke to him, some months back, he informed me that their viewers had reached 124 million. So Allahu Akbar. They plot and plan, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ Allah, and Allah plots and plans. وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ, and Allah is the best of those who plot and plan. So Allah's message will be spread. So we see all of this current opposition globally as being a good sign. Means that we're doing the right thing. Were we not doing the right thing, then we would be ignored. We would be of no consequence. And we would not be of any effect in the global circumstances to spread Islam. We would then become like puppets or toys that the powers that be could just play with. So alhamdulillah, we have borne the efforts to restrict our movements and expanded our dawah in other ways. With regards to Muslim youth today, my advice to you is that you learn Islam. You find out what Islam really is. I can appreciate that you can see Islam with the older generation as only customs, tradition, rites, and rituals which have very little impact on our lives. They are cultural in their nature. And this is really not Islam. Islam is a way of life, and I'm sure you've heard that many, many times. Reality is that for us to really appreciate it being a way of life and having a place in all aspects of our lives, we need to know it. We need to get back to the original sources and to learn Islam or to relearn Islam, to understand its teachings as it was meant to be understood, so that it can impact on our lives and on the lives of those around us. So my advice is to utilize whatever means are available. My university, the Islamic Online University, is among the means. It's readily accessible to all of you. So take advantage of it, as well as of other institutions that are rising up in your countries, that are online, etc., and increase your knowledge. And increase your knowledge not just to be admired, but to be guided. Because ultimately, that knowledge is what is going to guide us in this life and put us where we need to be in the next life. With regards to Muslims in general, my advice is basically the same. We need to revive the teachings of Islam. And there is a revival going on. There is an awakening taking place in the Muslim world. Muslims all over are much more active than they were 50 years ago, 100 years ago. So we need to continue to get more and more knowledge, because it is the knowledge of Islam which is going to guide that awakening. Where the knowledge of Islam is not accepted or not promoted, then these efforts, like in the case of the Arab Spring in Libya and in Egypt, etc., these efforts become undermined and people end up losing their way. And the revolution, the Islamic revolution, is sabotaged. And the goals that we sought are not attained. So my advice to Muslims today is to seek knowledge seriously, knowledge of Islam, to guide our individual lives, our communities, our societies, the Muslim nation, to take the motto of the Islamic Online University, changing the nation through education, and making it a motto for life. Barakallahu fikum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.